I unlocked the front door at 9:30 p.m. after a brutal 70-hour work week. I expected peace. Instead, I heard soft jazz floating from my kitchen, accompanied by the distinct laugh of a woman who didn't belong in my house. I walked down the marble hallway and stopped at the kitchen island. My husband, Ethan, sat on a leather bar stool wearing his work suit. Sitting beside him was Sarah, his ex-fiancée, wearing an oversized cashmere sweater and holding a glass of my 1982 Chateau Margaux, a bottle that cost $4,000. A bottle I bought to celebrate my executive promotion. "Victoria," Ethan said, turning his head with a casual, unbothered grin. "You're back late. We were just celebrating." "I can see that," I said smoothly, my voice flat, razor-sharp, and devoid of emotion. "Why is Sarah drinking my wine?" Sarah dropped her eyes, putting on a textbook display of fragile, helpless anxiety. "Victoria, please don't be upset with Ethan. I was in a really dark place and he was just being a good friend." "I am never upset, Sarah," I replied, stepping forward with deliberate, unhurried posture. "I am simply assessing an intrusion." "Look, Victoria, let's just lay it on the table," Ethan interrupted, leaning his elbows on the quartz island with absurd confidence. Sarah's boutique coffee shop in Soho was going under. The landlord threatened to seize her inventory tomorrow morning. She needed a lifeline. "And what does her financial incompetence have to do with my property?" I asked. "I transferred the money," Ethan declared proudly, crossing his arms. $200,000. From our joint house savings account. It went straight into her commercial trust an hour ago. I didn't scream. I didn't smash a glass. My pulse remained at a steady 60 beats per minute. I walked calmly up to Ethan, reached out my hand, and plucked the crystal wine glass straight from his fingers. I turned to the stainless steel sink and tipped the glass over, watching $400 worth of rare vintage drain away. Asterisk glug. 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 Asterisk. Hey. What the hell is wrong with you? Ethan barked, jumping off his bar stool with a reddened face. That was uncalled for. It was oxidized anyway, I said flatly, setting the empty glass down on the quartz counter with a quiet, authoritative clink. I unbuttoned my suit jacket, pulled my phone from my leather briefcase, and laid it flat between Ethan and Sarah. "Victoria, listen to me," Sarah whimpered, squeezing out a single, artful tear as she looked at Ethan for protection. "It's just a loan. I'm going to pay every single dollar back once the shop turns a profit. Ethan was just saving my life." "You've been losing money for 18 months, Sarah," I said, dropping a razor-sharp, mocking smirk. "Your business plan relies on hope, aesthetic social media posts, and poor accounting. You aren't going to turn a profit. You're going to go bankrupt." "Don't speak to her like that," Ethan shouted, stepping in front of Sarah as if he were guarding a child. "I have equal rights to our joint savings. We're married. I don't need your permission to manage our family finances." "You think stupidity is covered by our marriage contract?" I asked softly, my voice cutting through his panic like an ice pick. "It's my money too," he roared. "I put $50,000 into that account over 3 years. And I put $150,000 into it," I replied, leaning forward and resting my hands flat on the counter, locking my eyes onto his sweating face. "Which brings us to the legal reality of your celebration." Ethan blinked, his arrogant stance wavering for a fraction of a second. "What reality? Did you read the signature terms when we converted that account 6 months ago, Ethan?" I asked smoothly. "It's a standard joint checking account," he snapped. "It was a conditional mandate trust registered under Vance Capital," I corrected with absolute, cold authority. "Any disbursement over $10,000 requires a dual digital authorization key. Yours and mine." Ethan's face went entirely pale. I used the mobile app override." "You bypassed a corporate mandate using a forged secondary authorization code," I murmured, dropping a cold, ruthless smirk. "You didn't make a reckless marital withdrawal, Ethan. You committed civil wire fraud against my personal holding firm." Sarah gasped, looking between Ethan and me in sudden, sheer terror. "Ethan, what is she talking about?" "She's bluffing," Ethan stammered, his voice cracking into a defensive pitch. "You wouldn't sue your own husband." "I don't bluff, Ethan. I audit," I said flatly, picking up my phone and tapping the screen once. "My chief legal officer was notified the moment the wire cleared at 8 p.m. You have 12 hours to return $200,000 to the vault." I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on their paralyzed faces, and walked toward the stairs. "Enjoy the rest of the evening, Sarah," I called out without looking back. "It's the last time you'll ever sit in my kitchen." I came downstairs at 7 a.m. dressed in a tailored navy blazer and dark trousers. I found Ethan sitting in the formal living room. Sitting beside him on my cream velvet sofa was his mother, Brenda. She wore her usual oversized pearl necklace and held a tissue like a weapon ready to be deployed for fake tears. "Victoria," Brenda boomed, her voice dripping with artificial outrage. "Sit down. We need to discuss your monstrous behavior from last night." I didn't sit on their terms. I walked over to the marble side table, poured myself a cup of dark roasted black coffee, and took a slow, deliberate sip. "Good morning, Brenda," I said flatly, turning around to face them. "I see you brought an audience, Ethan. Did you think your mother could negotiate a wire fraud investigation for you? Stop calling it wire fraud." Ethan snapped, his eyes red and swollen from lack of sleep. "I helped a friend in need. Sarah was facing financial ruin, Victoria. Where is your empathy? Where is your heart?" "Empathy isn't a liquid asset, Ethan," I replied, leaning back comfortably in my wingback armchair. "And heart doesn't balance a ledger. You terrified poor Sarah last night." Brenda interjected, slamming her manicured palm onto her knee. "She called me sobbing at 2 in the morning. You threatened her with legal action over a simple family transfer." "Sarah isn't family," I murmured, taking another sip of coffee. "She's a bottomless pit for Ethan's poor decisions. We are a family." Brenda insisted, her tone rising into an unpleasant screech. "When one member prospers, we lift the others up. Ethan was using family resources to support a noble business venture. You earn millions advance capital, Victoria. $200,000 is pocket change for you. It's the principle." Ethan yelled, standing up to pace across my Turkish rug. "You control everything. You control the bank accounts. You control the schedule. I wanted to show Sarah that I have independence, that I can make big financial moves too." "You didn't make a big financial move," I said, dropping an icy razor-sharp smirk. "You stole from my corporate account to play savior for a woman who dumped you 4 years ago." I let them rant for 10 straight minutes. Brenda gave a dramatic speech about marital duty, traditional sacrifice, and my alleged inability to be a loving wife. Ethan nodded along, puffing out his chest as if his mother's emotional rhetoric somehow canceled out statutory banking regulations. I listened to every word with clinical indifference, drinking my coffee until the cup was completely empty. "Are you finished?" I asked smoothly when Brenda finally paused to catch her breath. "No, I am not." Brenda snapped, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You are going to log into your legal portal right now, sign a retroactive authorization waiver for that $200,000 transfer, and then you are going to call Sarah and apologize for your childish outburst last night." I almost laughed out loud at the sheer, delusional arrogance of her command. "Apologize?" I repeated, my tone dropping to an icy whisper. "Brenda, your entitlement is almost fascinating." I opened my leather portfolio on the side table, pulled out a crisp 2-page document with a heavy golden seal, and tossed it flat onto the glass coffee table between them. "But," Ethan frowned, staring down at the document. "What is this?" "Read line 3, Ethan," I commanded flatly. He leaned forward with trembling fingers, scanning the paper. His face instantly drained of color, his jaw dropping open. This is a land registry transfer deed." "What does that mean?" Brenda demanded, leaning over her son's shoulder with squinted eyes. "Ethan owns half of this house. He signed the original deed." "He signed the original deed 4 years ago," I corrected with absolute, unshakable authority. "And 3 months ago, after I caught Ethan sending $5,000 monthly payments to Sarah under the table, I initiated a private buyout clause." "What buyout clause?" Ethan gasped, looking up at me in pure horror. "Paragraph 12 of our premarital equity agreement," I said smoothly, resting my chin on my laced fingers. "Any unauthorized transfer of personal assets to a third party triggers an automatic option for the primary investor to liquidate remaining mortgage equity. I paid off your remaining $80,000 equity share through my private holding trust in May." Ethan grabbed the deed, his hands shaking violently as he flipped to the final page. You bought me out?" "The transfer was finalized by the county clerk last Friday," I murmured, dropping a razor-thin, cold smirk. "This $5 million townhome is officially 100% my sole property. You don't own a single brick, Ethan. You can't do this." Brenda shrieked, jumping off the couch in a blind rage. "This is his home. You can't just throw him out." "I haven't thrown him out yet," I said flatly, standing up from my armchair and buttoning my navy blazer. "I am, however, throwing you out." Excuse me? Brenda gasped, clutching her pearls in shock. I checked my gold wristwatch. It is 7:25 a.m. You have precisely 2 minutes to gather your purse and exit my front door, Brenda. If you are still standing on my velvet rug at 7:27, I will press the panic button on my phone and have the police remove you for criminal trespassing. Victoria. She's my mother. Ethan roared, stepping between us. And this is my house, I replied, looking him straight in the eyes with cold, unyielding power. Choose your next word very carefully, Ethan. Because if you raise your voice to me again on my property, your bags will be sitting on the curb right beside her. Brenda looked at my face, realized there wasn't a single shred of mercy in my eyes, and grabbed her handbag with a humiliated, furious gasp. She stormed down the marble hallway without saying another word. I turned back to Ethan, who was standing frozen in the center of the room, clutching the land deed like a death sentence. Enjoy your breakfast, Ethan, I said smoothly, picking up my briefcase. Legal services will be delivering your formal eviction notice at noon. At 9:15 a.m., my encrypted executive calendar flashed red. Asterisk emergency board meeting. Location, floor 50, executive suite. Asterisk. The agenda item was unsubtle. Review of Senior Managing Director Victoria Vance's fiscal management and operational competency. Ethan had used his remaining administrative clearance at Vance Capital to collaborate with Julian Mercer, my longtime rival executive on the board, to stage a public execution. I almost respected the sheer, desperate speed of his retaliation. I adjusted the cuffs of my crisp white power suit, picked up my sleek titanium tablet, and walked down the glass corridor toward the main boardroom. When the heavy frosted doors slid open, 20 senior board members were already seated around the 30-foot polished mahogany table. At the far end stood Julian Mercer, wearing a smug smirk. Sitting beside him in a guest chair was Ethan, trying, and failing, to project the aura of an aggrieved partner acting in the firm's best interest. Ah, Victoria, Julian purred, leaning against the head of the table. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. We were just reviewing some rather alarming documentation brought to our attention by your husband. I walked in with deliberate, unhurried steps, the sharp click of my heels echoing off the reinforced glass walls. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table, resting my hands flat on the polished wood. Ethan isn't an employee of Vance Capital, Julian, I said smoothly, my tone flat, razor-sharp, and unbothered. He's a guest. And you are wasting $50,000 an hour of billable board time on a personal dispute. This isn't a personal dispute, Victoria, Ethan interjected, standing up rapidly to command the room. He pointed a dramatic, trembling finger at me. Members of the board, my wife's emotional stability has completely unraveled over the past 72 hours. She is suffering from severe personal stress, and it is directly impacting her management of client accounts. A few junior board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. I didn't flinch. I sat back in my chair, dropping a faint, razor-thin smirk. Do go on, Ethan, I murmured. Give the board your full performance. Ethan pulled a thick stack of printed ledger reports from his leather folder and tossed them into the center of the table. Yesterday, Ethan announced loudly, Victoria authorized an illegal freeze on $200,000 of funds intended for commercial investment. She claims it was corporate fraud, but the truth is she is using firm resources to wage a personal vendetta against my business partners. Look at those transaction logs. She mismanaged secondary client liquidity to block a legitimate commercial transfer. Julian nodded with practiced concern, stepping forward. If Victoria is letting marital friction compromise our liquidity protocols, the board must vote for her immediate suspension pending an internal audit. We cannot have a senior director using Vance Capital assets for personal spites. I watched them both with clinical detachment. It was almost cute. They had built an entire house of cards on the assumption that I would panic, cry, or beg the board for privacy. Are you finished? I asked softly, my voice cutting through the tense room like a diamond blade. The paper trail speaks for itself, Victoria, Julian sneered. You're done. The paper trail you provided is 3 hours out of date, Julian, I replied smoothly. Without looking down, I tapped a single key on my titanium tablet. Beep. The dual 75-inch high-definition screens behind Julian instantly flickered to life, overriding his presentation slides. A high-contrast forensic audit spreadsheet appeared, complete with highlighted banking routing numbers, IP tracking logs, and certified federal compliance stamps. Ethan's face went entirely pale. Julian's smug smirk vanished in a split second. What is that? Ethan stammered, staring at the screens. That is a real-time forensic trace executed by Vance Capital's cyber fraud department at 8 a.m. today, I said, leaning forward and resting my chin on my laced fingers. Let's review the actual routing path of that $200,000 transfer, shall we? I swiped my finger across the tablet. A red line highlighted the exact money trail on the big screens. The money didn't go to Sarah's coffee shop equipment vendor, I declared with absolute, cold authority. It was routed through Sarah's commercial account and immediately wired into Apex Global Holdings, a shell entity registered in the Cayman Islands. I turned my head slowly to look Julian dead in the eye. An entity where Julian Mercer holds 40% beneficial ownership, I added smoothly. And where Ethan was promised an undisclosed $200,000 consulting fee next month. The boardroom erupted into sudden, shocked whispers. Several senior board members leaned back from Julian as if he were radioactive. This is a setup. Julian barked, his face flushing dark red as he slammed his hand onto the table. This data is fabricated. It's signed by the Chief Compliance Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank, Julian, I murmured, dropping a razor-sharp, mocking smile. Try calling him a liar. Ethan looked at Julian, then back at me, his eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. Victoria? I didn't know about Apex. Julian told me it was an offshore holding account for Sarah's inventory. Ignorance isn't a legal defense for corporate espionage, Ethan, I said flatly, standing up from my chair and buttoning my suit jacket. I picked up my tablet, looking down the table at the paralyzed board. As of 5 minutes ago, I announced to the room, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District was provided with this complete data packet. Julian, your security badge has been deactivated. Ethan, your visitor pass is revoked. I walked toward the glass exit doors, stopping right beside Ethan's frozen frame. Thank you for calling this meeting, gentlemen, I whispered, leaning in close so only he could hear. You just handed me the legal leverage to strip both of your careers to zero. The heavy frosted doors slid open, and I walked out into the clear corridor while security guards stepped into the room to escort Julian away. I sat at the marble dining table in my foyer, sipping espresso alongside my chief legal partner, Elena Rostova. We were reviewing the final drafted complaints for civil fraud. The house was quiet until the front door slammed open at 2 p.m. Ethan rushed into the foyer, his tie untied, suit jacket rumpled, and hair sticking up in wild spikes. He didn't even notice Elena. He pulled his phone from his pocket with trembling hands and tapped the screen furiously. Work, damn it. Work, he muttered, pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. I set my porcelain cup down on its saucer with a quiet, authoritative clink. Trouble with your banking portal, Ethan? I asked smoothly, my tone flat, razor-sharp, and utterly unbothered. He froze, glaring at me with bloodshot, panic-stricken eyes. What did you do, Victoria? I'm trying to wire $50,000 to my legal defense retainer, and the transaction keeps failing. My card declined 3 times in a row. Declined? I repeated, dropping a faint, razor-thin smirk. How unfortunate. Don't play dumb with me. Ethan screamed, stepping toward the table and waving his phone like a weapon. I know you're behind this. That money is sitting in our secondary investment fund. I have every right to withdraw my share to hire an attorney. Elena didn't even look up from her legal tablet. Actually, Mr. Vance, under Section 4 of the Corporate Securities Enforcement Act, you don't. Ethan blinked, noticing Elena for the first time. Who the hell are you? Ms. Rostova is Vance Capital's lead litigation partner, I informed him, leaning back comfortably in my leather dining chair. And 3 hours ago, following the evidence exposed in the boardroom, she filed an emergency injunction with the state court. An injunction? Ethan gasped, his jaw dropping open as his phone slipped an inch in his sweaty palm. An asset freeze, Elena corrected crisply, finally looking up with a cold, professional smile. Every single liquid account, secondary fund, credit facility, and investment portfolio bearing your name has been placed under administrative hold. You are officially locked out. You froze my money? Ethan roared, his face flushing a violent shade of red. All of it. How am I supposed to pay for a lawyer? How am I supposed to eat? I suggest applying for a public defender, I replied calmly. I hear their caseloads are quite educational. You monster. Ethan shrieked, slamming his palm against the marble table. You're trying to destroy me. You're trying to send me to prison without even giving me a chance to fight back. We were married for 4 years. And for 3 of those years, you treated my personal wealth like your private charity, I said, leaning forward and locking my eyes onto his frantic, sweating face. You gambled your freedom on Julian Mercer's scheme. Now you get to pay the house. I was manipulated. Ethan sobbed, his loud rage instantly crumbling into a pathetic, desperate whine. He dropped to his knees right beside the marble table, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. Victoria, please? I made a mistake. Sarah tricked me. Julian lied to me. They told me it was a risk-free investment. You know I'm not smart enough to execute corporate fraud. I almost laughed out loud at the sheer tragic absurdity of his defense argument. Claiming severe incompetence to escape a federal indictment was a new low, even for him. You were smart enough to sign the wire authorization, Ethan, I murmured, taking my silver fountain pen from my blazer pocket. And you were arrogant enough to think I wouldn't track it. Please, Victoria, he begged, reaching a trembling hand out toward my knee. Just lift the freeze on $20,000. Just enough for a retainer. I'll sign whatever divorce papers you want. I'll walk away and never speak to you again. Don't touch the suit, I commanded softly. His hand froze 2 inches from my fabric. I unhitched the cap of my fountain pen with a slow, deliberate click, signed the bottom line of a heavy parchment document on my folder, and capped the pen with absolute authority. I picked up the document and slid it across the marble table until it tapped against his trembling knuckles. What is this? Ethan whimpered, staring at the paper. That is your formal notice of eviction, I said flatly, my voice cutting through his heavy breathing like an ice pick. Effective immediately. As the sole owner of this property, I am revoking your residential access. Eviction? Ethan gasped, staggering backward onto his feet. You're throwing me out right now? I checked my gold wristwatch. It was 2:12 p.m. You have precisely 60 minutes to step upstairs, pack a single suitcase with your personal clothing, and hand over your biometric house keys to security, I declared with cold, unyielding authority. At 3:12 p.m. Marcus will lock the gates. Anything left inside becomes abandoned property. I have nowhere to go. Ethan screamed, tears streaming down his face. My mother won't take my calls. My cards are declined. I don't even have cash for a hotel. Then I suggest you move quickly, I murmured, picking up my espresso cup and taking a slow, satisfying sip. The bus station is a 4-mile walk. At 4 p.m., the velvet ropes outside the Velvet Bean in Soho were packed with minor influencers and tabloid photographers. Sarah stood near a tower of champagne flutes, wearing a white designer dress she clearly couldn't afford. Standing beside her in a wrinkled jacket was Ethan, holding a cheap glass of Prosecco and trying desperately to look like a visionary venture capitalist. They were holding a grand opening. A victory lap funded by stolen money. I stepped out of my black town car, wearing a tailored charcoal coat. Trailing behind me was my senior property manager, alongside 2 uniformed municipal court bailiffs holding rolled legal writs. I didn't wait in line. I pushed past the velvet rope, my heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor. Victoria? Ethan gasped, nearly dropping his glass as I walked straight to the center of the room. What are you doing here? You can't ruin this for Sarah. Sarah paused mid-speech, her glass held high toward a camera crew. Victoria, please don't cause a scene. This is a private celebration of my new journey. Your new journey ended 15 minutes ago, Sarah, I said smoothly, my tone flat, razor-sharp, and unbothered. What is the meaning of this? Sarah shrieked, her artificial smile collapsing into instant rage. I secured high-profile angel backing. The press is here. You didn't secure backing, I replied, stepping forward with deliberate, terrifying calm. You received $200,000 of stolen corporate capital. That wire is under civil dispute. Ethan interjected, stepping into my space with puffing chest. You've frozen my personal accounts, Victoria, but Sarah's commercial lease is legally separate. You have no jurisdiction over this building. I dropped a cold, razor-thin smirk, pulling a gold fountain pen from my coat pocket. I don't need jurisdiction over your lease, Ethan, I murmured. I own the building. Sarah froze, her face draining of color. What? I gestured to my property manager, who stepped forward and unrolled a thick commercial deed with a golden city seal. 3 months ago, I informed the stunned crowd, Vance Real Estate Holdings quietly acquired this entire commercial block. I am your landlord, Sarah. So what? Ethan yelled, sweating profusely under the event lights. She has a signed 5-year commercial lease. You can't just kick her out because you own the brick. Paragraph 18 of the commercial lease agreement, my property manager announced crisply. Any lease secured using fraudulent, unverified, or illicitly transferred funds is void ab initio. The lease never existed. The news cameras instantly turned away from Sarah, aiming their wide-angle lenses straight at the unrolled foreclosure warrant. No, no. Sarah whimpered, dropping her champagne flute. It shattered against the concrete floor with a violent, echoing crash. You can't do this. I spent 6 months designing this space. I have $50,000 in perishable inventory in the back. Then I suggest you load it into trash bags, I said flatly. Victoria, please? Ethan begged, stepping toward me with desperate, trembling hands. Look at the cameras. Think of your reputation. You're destroying a woman's dream on live media. She didn't have a dream, Ethan, I replied, looking down at him with unyielding authority. She had an expensive hobby funded by your stupidity. I turned my head to the head bailiff. Lock the doors. Wait. Sarah screamed as the bailiffs began pushing the crowd toward the street. My equipment. My espresso machines. I leased them. They are currently seized as physical evidence under the corporate fraud indictment, I murmured, taking a slow step back toward the open exit. Any attempt to remove hardware from this building will result in an immediate felony charge. You monster. Sarah shrieked, bursting into violent, hysterical tears as her guests scrambled out the doors to avoid being named in the police report. You ruined my life. You ruined your own life when you spent my money on cheap coffee, I replied smoothly. The heavy glass doors swung shut. The head bailiff slid a heavy steel chain through the brass handles and snapped a yellow lock into place, slapping a bright red foreclosed poster over Sarah's grand opening sign. Ethan and Sarah were left standing on the cold curb in the rain, surrounded by flashing media bulbs, pointing cameras, and mocking whispers from the high society crowd they tried so hard to impress. I pulled my gloves on, stepped into the back seat of my town car and looked out the window. Ethan caught my eye through the glass, mouthing the words please. I rolled up the tinted window, tapped the front partition and said flatly, drive. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glistened with crystal chandeliers, but the air smelled strictly of net worth and artificial smiles. I stood near the marble mezzanine, sipping expensive vintage champagne. I wore an emerald satin gown with a razor-sharp silhouette. In high finance, perception is currency and I was looking like $1 trillion. Victoria! A loud, theatrical sob echoed across the polished parquet floor. I didn't flinch. I took a slow, deliberate sip from my flute. Brenda marched up the stairs, flanked by an uncomfortable-looking Ethan. She was wearing a cheap past-season dress, her eyes swollen with calculated, public-facing tears. Several high-profile venture capitalists and board directors turned immediately, sensing blood in the water. Victoria, please? Brenda cried out, loud enough to stop 3 surrounding conversations. Have you no soul? Look at what you've done to my boy. Hello, Brenda, I murmured flatly, resting one hand against the gilded railing. You're making a spectacle. And your tone is missing a few octaves of self-awareness. You threw him out on the street, she screamed, dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. You froze his bank accounts. You destroyed his reputation over a simple, harmless financial misunderstanding between family. Ethan stepped forward, looking emaciated and completely broken. Victoria, everyone is watching. Just tell the board to drop the civil suit. I have nothing left. You've taken my home, my career, my pride. Pride implies value, Ethan, I replied, dropping a razor-thin, icy smirk. You traded yours for a $200,000 illusion. She's a monster. Brenda announced to the surrounding circle of millionaires, raising her voice to a dramatic crescendo. She treats human beings like numbers on a spreadsheet. She ruined a young woman's coffee shop. She forced her own husband into poverty. Is this the kind of leader Vance Capital elevates? I looked at her hysterical, red face with clinical detachment. I almost laughed out loud at the sheer desperation of her grand finale. She actually thought public embarrassment would force a corporate executive to fold. Are you finished with your audition, Brenda? I asked smoothly. I am fighting for my son, she shrieked. Instead of arguing, I turned on my heel and walked calmly toward the small stage where the gala chairman was standing beside a podium microphone. The room fell into an expectant, dead silence. I stepped up to the microphone, adjusting the stand with a single, practiced motion. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice projecting through the crystal speakers with absolute, unshakable authority. Tonight is about giving back to those who truly deserve a fresh start. I pulled a sleek leather checkbook from my evening clutch, tapped my gold fountain pen against the podium, and signed my name with a sharp flourish. Click. Vance Capital is built on absolute fiscal integrity, I continued, looking directly at the stunned crowd. To demonstrate our commitment to true resilience, I am personally donating $500,000 to the New York Shelter for Financially Exploited Women. Applaud erupted instantly across the ballroom. High society patrons clapped enthusiastically, entirely captivated by the gesture. I held up a hand, letting the applause taper off, and fixed my eyes directly on Brenda and Ethan standing at the base of the stairs. Because true financial independence means holding parasites accountable, I added smoothly into the microphone. And speaking of accountability, I stepped down from the stage, my heavy satin dress sweeping the floor as I walked directly back to Brenda. What are you talking about? Ethan whispered, stepping back in sheer terror. I signed the final enforcement order at 4 p.m. today, Ethan, I informed him, my tone flat, freezing and precise. The state court approved our wage garnishment petition. Brenda gasped. Wage garnishment? Precisely, I said, leaning in close so the surrounding investors could hear every single syllable. 60% of every dollar Ethan earns for the next 15 years will be automatically routed into my legal recovery fund. You will be working for me until you are 45, Ethan. Ethan's face went entirely ghost white. He stumbled backward, his knees giving out until he caught himself against a pillar. 60%? You wanted to make big financial moves, I whispered, dropping a cold, triumphant smirk. Consider this your lifetime investment plan. I handed my empty champagne glass to a stunned waiter, smoothed down my emerald gown, and walked past them toward the grand exit. Security, I called out smoothly to the guards standing at the heavy mahogany doors. Escort these two off the premises. They don't have the assets to be in this room. At 10 a.m., I sat at the head of a dark walnut conference table in a high-security settlement suite. Across from me sat Ethan. He looked unrecognizable. His designer suit had been replaced by a wrinkled gray sweater, his dark circles hung down to his cheekbones, and his hands trembled continuously on the table. Beside him sat his court-appointed public defender, looking thoroughly exhausted and completely defeated before we even opened our folders. Victoria, Ethan rasped, his voice cracking on the first syllable. Please. Look at me. I didn't look up immediately. I unclipped my titanium pen, laid it flat beside my leather folder, and smoothed down the cuff of my sharp ivory blazer. I am looking at you, Ethan, I said flatly, my tone razor-sharp, freezing, and utterly unbothered. I see a man facing 2 federal counts of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. It doesn't have to go to trial. Ethan cried out, leaning forward as far as his public defender would allow. I'm begging you. I will sign a total waiver. I'll forfeit every single claim to joint property, the furniture, the cars, everything. Just tell the district attorney you want to drop the criminal complaint. I almost laughed out loud at his delusion. He still believed a federal criminal charge was something I could flip off like a kitchen light switch. The state of New York is prosecuting you, Ethan, I informed him, leaning back comfortably in my leather armchair. Not me. I am simply the key witness with 200 gigabytes of incontrovertible banking evidence. Ms. Vance, his public defender interjected, rubbing his temples in sheer fatigue. My client is prepared to execute an immediate, unconditional surrender of all marital and personal claims if your firm submits a letter of full restitution to the judge. Restitution requires capital, I replied smoothly, dropping a razor-thin, cold smirk. Your client doesn't have a nickel left in his bank accounts. I have my sports car. Ethan blurted out, tears welling in his bloodshot eyes. I have my private stock portfolio in tech. Take them. Take all of it. Just save me from prison, Victoria. I can't survive in a federal facility. You know I can't. You should have calculated the cost of prison before playing wire fraud mastermind with Julian Mercer, I murmured. I opened my folder with deliberate, terrifying calm. I extracted 2 crisp, single-page legal contracts with heavy red seals and slid them across the polished walnut table. Slide. The paper tapped against Ethan's trembling knuckles. What is this? Ethan whimpered, wiping his wet nose with the sleeve of his sweater. Your final resolution, I declared with absolute, unyielding authority. 2 options. Option A is a complete civil liquidation. You sign over the titles to your sports car, your private stock accounts, and your secondary retirement fund to my legal recovery trust to cover my court fees and firm losses. Ethan blinked, staring at the paper. And option B? Option B is I withhold the restitution letter, I said flatly. The federal prosecutor moves forward with maximum charges, and you serve a mandatory minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. 10 years. Ethan shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic scream. That's a decade of my life. I'm only 32. You're stripping me of everything I own and leaving me with nothing. You left yourself with nothing the moment you stole from my firm to feed your ego, I replied, looking him dead in the eye without a single shred of mercy. Sign option A or enjoy the federal penitentiary. He can't sign away his entire life's assets, Ms. Vance, the public defender protested weakly. He can, I snapped back, my voice cutting through the room like a steel guillotine. Or he can spend the next decade eating prison food. Choose Ethan. You have 30 seconds. Ethan looked down at the document. Tears spilled over his cheeks, splashing onto the white paper. His jaw worked silently as he realized the brutal, hyperlogical reality of his situation. He had zero leverage, zero power, zero escape. I need a pen, he sobbed, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. I picked up my heavy silver fountain pen from the table and held it out across the dark wood. 3 signatures, I commanded smoothly. Page 1, page 3, and the title transfer notary sheet. Ethan reached out with a trembling, slippery hand and took the pen. He wept loudly, wiping his face with his arm as he pressed the silver tip to the paper. Asterisk scribble. 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 Asterisk. He signed away his car, his stocks, his future, and his pride in 3 messy, frantic strokes. He slammed the pen down and dropped his head onto the table, sobbing in utter, irreversible defeat. I pulled the signed document back toward my side of the table, checked every signature with clinical precision, and capped my fountain pen with a loud, definitive click. Pleasure doing business with you, Ethan, I said, standing up and buttoning my blazer. My security team will collect your vehicle keys at noon. I picked up my leather portfolio, turned on my heel, and walked out of the room without looking back once. 6 months after the federal indictments dropped, Vance Capital shattered every quarterly earnings record in corporate history. At 5 p.m. during golden hour, the sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my newly expanded corner executive suite on the 65th floor. The entire Manhattan skyline lay stretched beneath my high-heeled shoes like a sprawling, geometric empire. I took a slow sip of vintage Macallan, my posture perfectly straight, my mind entirely untroubled. A quiet knock sounded at the double oak doors. My executive assistant, Chloe, stepped onto the polished marble floor holding a sleek glass tablet. Congratulations on the final Q3 figures, Senior Director Vance, Chloe said, her voice filled with genuine awe. You've officially doubled our international portfolio yield. Yield is a mathematical certainty when you cut out dead weight, Chloe, I replied smoothly, not turning away from the window view. Are the expansion contracts ready for signature? Yes, ma'am. But before we execute the overseas acquisition, a public record update just cleared the legal portal, Chloe said, hesitating slightly. Regarding your ex-husband's ongoing financial compliance. I turned around slowly, my satin silk dress catching the golden sunlight. Did Ethan miss a wage garnishment installment? No, Chloe replied, tapping the screen and extending the tablet toward me. His automated deduction went through precisely at 4 p.m. I took the tablet. On the screen was a live public compliance profile alongside a recent photo. Ethan was wearing a faded gray uniform polo shirt, standing behind a counter at a budget mail sorting facility in New Jersey. His eyes were hollow, his posture slumped into a permanent curve of defeat. 60% of his entry-level clerk paycheck was routed straight into my holding account every alternate Friday. He would be sorting packages for the next 15 years to pay back my legal fees. Below his profile was a secondary tabloid article. Soho boutique property foreclosed. Former owner Sarah Lynn files personal bankruptcy. Her high-end equipment had been auctioned at 50 cents on the dollar, leaving her with zero credit and a blacklisted commercial record across the tri-state area. I looked at the screens for precisely 3 seconds. No anger. No spite. No satisfaction. Just pure, clinical indifference. I almost laughed at the memory of them standing in my living room 6 months ago, foolishly believing they had the capacity to play in my league. They really thought they could take down a Vance, I murmured flatly. Shall I save these compliance records to your personal archive, Victoria? Chloe asked softly. No, I replied, swiping the article away with a swift, careless flick of my index finger. Delete the notifications. Irrelevant data isn't worth storage space on my server. I handed the tablet back to Chloe, walked over to my 60-foot mahogany desk, and took my seat in the high-backed leather armchair. I unscrewed the cap of my solid gold fountain pen. Resting on the center blotter was the $3 billion international expansion agreement with European Prime Capital. The deal Julian Mercer had spent 5 years trying and failing to secure. Click. Call the global board members, I commanded with absolute, unshakable authority. Tell them to join the secure server immediately. Right away, ma'am, Chloe said, bowing her head and stepping out of the office. I pressed the gold pen tip to the heavy parchment paper. I signed my name with 3 sharp, flawless strokes, sealing my undisputed dominance over the market. I capped the pen, rested my hands flat on the mahogany desk, and looked out over the glowing city. The game was over. My authority was absolute.